We want, friends, to talk about a broad topic. I think you see in the information space all these statements, all these headlines, all these threats, and the prospects that Belarus might enter the war against Ukraine. At the same time, there have been visits by both Trump and Putin to China. At the same time, we see statements that Putin is ready to end the war by the end of the year if his conditions are met. So we want to connect all these processes and understand whether we are really entering some kind of endgame in this war, and that the stakes will only continue to rise in order to try to end this war. So who will outplay whom? Will it be us and our allies? And we all believe that this is exactly what will happen. Let's try to discuss this with Mr. Taras. Let's begin.
I missed it. I mentioned the nuclear exercises that are currently
starting
in Belarus. Nuclear weapons are already there. And as Lukashenko himself said, their long-held dream has finally come true, as these warheads are now located on the territory of Belarus. In your opinion, Mr. Taras, is Lukashenko really ready to involve his own army against Ukraine? How serious is the situation here?
Well, in fact, we have seen from the very beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that there have been systematic and numerous attempts by Putin's regime to drag Lukashenko and, accordingly, the army of the Republic of Belarus into direct combat operations on the territory of Ukraine. This was due to the fact that Putin's initial strategic plan for the invasion in February 2022 was actually a copy of what happened in February 2014 in Crimea. And that's exactly why the Russians acted the way they did, yes, driving in their parade uniforms, in those columns and so on, because their task was to reach the key points they needed to occupy in the eastern and central regions of Ukraine as quickly as possible. And just like in Crimea in February 2014, simply say, now we're here. This is your new reality. And because these plans were disrupted, the Putin regime had to switch to the format of a full-scale war, using absolutely all available resources, even resorting to partial mobilization, and so on. By that point, it had already become clear to the Kremlin that they needed Belarus's help, both in manpower and in military technical support, and so on. And Lukashenko understood this perfectly well, too. And seeing what was happening to Russian soldiers on Ukrainian territory, he clearly did not want to agree to the Belarusian army, so to speak, following in the footsteps of Putin's occupiers. And we saw how, over these 4 years, Lukashenko was balancing. In fact, he very skillfully caught Russian propaganda by the tongue, which constantly started talking, kept saying that in Ukraine, Russia was fighting against NATO, against America, and so on. And Lukashenko took advantage of this. His main argument was this, that yes, indeed, this is a war with NATO, but NATO could also attack the territory of both Russia and Belarus and this so-called Union state, and so on. Since it has already happened that the Russian army is fully involved in the war in Ukraine, then who will defend the Union state if the Belarusian army is also drawn into this war? And Lukashenko always argued that the Belarusian army must not be touched because it is kept in reserve. It would serve as a kind of barrier to protect against a NATO attack, yes, from 4 directions, classic yes. So, and with this, well, it's not that he convinced Putin. Putin understood that he couldn't have any counter-arguments against this logic because he would have to cross out his own propaganda. And in this context, we saw how it worked for 4 years, but we understood perfectly well, practically from the very beginning, and this isn't even about 2022, it's about 2014, that for the Russian Federation, for the Putin regime, the war against Ukraine is, as they say, not an end in itself. This is an element of a larger strategy to restore the Russian Federation to the status of this so-called USSR 2.0, yes. And from the very beginning, Putin was interested not only in, as they say, bringing together the entire post-Soviet space, but also in restoring and redistributing spheres of influence in Europe following the Cold War model. That is to regain a kind of Warsaw Pact, which would include not only Poland, yes, but in fact, even back then, half of Germany was part of the Warsaw Pact organization. And this is exactly what is connected to, remember that quote from Rebkov, Lavrov's deputy, who said, NATO should pack up and withdraw to the 1997 line. In other words, they wanted to push back and essentially reclaim their spheres of influence in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's why, for the Putin regime, Ukraine was just one of the stages in implementing this strategic plan. And the strategic plan was to destabilize or even collapse NATO from within by any means, whether through the use of hybrid tools and disinformation, through hybrid provocations on the eastern flank, or even a direct strike against NATO itself, which would prove that Article 5 does not work in practice. That would be the collapse of the entire collective security system. Therefore, sooner or later, Putin would have to move to this stage of escalation against NATO's eastern flank and against the North Atlantic Alliance as a whole. He just had to wait until all the circumstances came together, yes, all the geopolitical conditions. And ultimately, right now, this moment, well, so to speak, with Trump's presidency, he is very close to this point of no return. And now Putin will catch Lukashenko by his word and say, what was it you said that you need to be kept fresh to fight against NATO? Well, here you go, your time has come. Because, well, right now NATO is weakened. The United States of America has distanced itself from Europe. Roman Borenko, we are ready to start a hybrid escalation on NATO's eastern flank. And now Lukashenko will have no counter-arguments because that's exactly what he was talking about. And now, in fact, nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus are a kind of insurance policy for Lukashenko in this case, for this scenario, because he now understands that his conventional army could be drawn, so to speak, into these Russian hybrid operations on NATO's eastern flank. And the presence of Russian nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus is beneficial to him because now he will say, look, this weapon is an important geopolitical tool for the Kremlin's blackmail. This weapon and its security cannot be put at risk because that would take away this trump card of Putin's nuclear blackmail. Therefore, it is unacceptable to allow hostilities to be transferred to the territory of the Republic of Belarus. And what needs to be done to prevent this so that the Belarusian army does not take part in provocations against NATO's eastern flank. So, in reality, why is Lukashenko so happy now that there are Russian nuclear weapons on his territory? It's not because he realizes that, in fact, there are already, I understand that the targeting markers for strikes on, well, let's say, have already been entered into the strike systems of NATO member countries, yes, specifically targeting the territory of Belarus, the coordinates where the nuclear weapon depots are located, where this potential Russian nest will be deployed, and so on. Roman Borenko, the point is that Lukashenko now has a potential additional argument not only to avoid being drawn into the war against Ukraine, but also into hybrid aggression against NATO. Because he will argue that it is necessary to preserve the integrity of this nuclear weapon. Therefore, it is unacceptable for the territory of Belarus to turn into a battlefield, which is exactly what would happen if the Belarusian army were to take part in these provocations against NATO. Well, now we will wait to see how the Putin regime responds to this, because, well, this situation is new for them. But, well, it's already obvious that these exercises currently taking place, yes, the nuclear ones, are actually delayed in time. They were supposed to take place in February. And as a rule, they used to take place in February. And so if we look at 2021 to 2022, the entire Russian invasion of Ukraine began with the Zapad 2021 exercises. And its practical phase was launched from the Grom 2022 exercises, which took place in February. But now we see that these exercises have been shifted to the current period. Obviously, this is tied to Putin's visit to Xi Jinping, because it's clear that Putin cannot start an escalation against NATO without Xi's approval. Roman Borenko, Xi must be kept informed. And China must be prepared for such a turn of events, because China is playing its own game, in which Putin also has his role and place. And in fact, well, now, Putin is using these nuclear exercises to strengthen Russia's military presence in Belarus, and perhaps to try to persuade Lukashenko to finally expel Vladislav Avdiyenko.
But this visit of Putin to Xi was not a stage of coordination, just as in 2022, we remember, the Olympics in China took place, and those 68,000 Russian and Belarusian military groupings, can they really...
Roman Borenko crossed the border? Hey.
How?
Absolutely, yes. You are absolutely right with this parallel. Moreover, the situation here is even now, around this agreement with Xi Jinping, more interesting and complicated, because obviously the agreement already exists. And this agreement took place at the end of August, at the beginning of September last year, when the SCO summit was held in Tianjin. Putin went there. All of this smoothly transitioned into the victory parade in Beijing. And we remember Kim Jong-un was also there, and the three of them, Xi, Un, and Putin, yes, they gathered there and discussed certain matters. Immediately, in fact, less than a week after Putin returned from Beijing, Russian drones flew towards Poland. So even at that point, it was already clear that Xi had given his approval to start destabilizing NATO's eastern flank in a hybrid sense. And Russia began to implement this plan. But obviously Trump threw a wrench in their plans, because at that moment it seems preparations for the operation in Venezuela had begun. And January of 26th year was marked by, well, because it's clear that Russia is now acting against NATO's eastern flank according to the same logic it used when launching aggression against Ukraine. That is, this is the principle of Salami tactics. They gradually raise the level of escalation, gradually slice off, so to speak, yes, this hybrid toolkit, and gradually raise the stakes. So we saw how the Russians started with maritime hybrid provocations, yes, in the Baltic Sea. Then the air provocations began, and eventually Russian border guards and FSB agents openly crossed the border into Estonia and Latvia, almost in front of cameras. They spent several hours on the territory of the Baltic countries and then turned back. That's it. So in fact, all three dimensions, sea, air and land, have already been blocked by the Russians, so to speak. They tested the alliance's reaction, they tested the reaction of NATO's eastern flank, and realized that no one would be in a hurry to invoke Article 5 or respond in any other way. And in fact, everything was already prepared to gradually put this whole puzzle together, meaning to add air provocations to the ground ones, and then to include the maritime dimension as well. And so it all works according to the principle of the frog sitting in a pot of water that's gradually being heated. The eastern flank of NATO could suddenly find itself in a situation of a hot war, but it wouldn't even realize how it happened. Roman Burenko. So this whole theater isn't for us, Roman Burenko. Absolutely. And the operation in Venezuela and then the operation against Iran messed up the timing, right? So in fact, everything was supposed to start around April or May in order to completely disorganize NATO by the summer. And accordingly, with a victory, Putin would hold the September elections to the State Duma. Trump's hands stopped shaking, and in November he would hold the midterms. But then Iran happened, and the timelines had to be adjusted because, well, this operation in Iran was connected to Trump's visit to Xi. Trump wanted to come to Xi as a winner, to do with Iran what he did with Venezuela. Vladislav Avdiyenko.
In early April, he planned to go, but Roman said,
postponed. And in the end, Trump went, but he went not as a winner, but as a supplicant, yes, asking Xi to influence his proxy dictatorship in Tehran, to open the Strait of Hormuz, and so on, yes. And for that, Trump essentially gave up Taiwan. And here the timing fell apart. Yes, so here the more pressing issue for Putin is the State Duma elections, yes, in September, because it's already clear that there will be a connection to how much this escalation against NATO will be able to boost the ratings of Putin personally and United Russia. If everything goes well, they will start this operation before the elections. And if something goes wrong, they can simply put the elections on pause if they see that it's not working. Or if Xi says, let's wait, because Trump is behaving very well. He's giving us Taiwan, freezing military aid of $14 billion, yes, to Taiwan. Let's let him have a smooth election in November, so we won't push this wave and we won't create problems for him in NATO. Roman Burenko. And let the summit in Ankara go smoothly as well, so that Erdogan is satisfied too. Then, in fact, this operation will be postponed. But the fact that the Russians are ready for it and they're just, coordinating a new timing with Xi Jinping right now seems to me to be an undeniable fact. Roman Burenko. In the second part,
yes.
Vlad Avdiyenko.
Yes, where do we stand in all this, and should we expect anything from Belarus since both the president and intelligence are talking about it? We'll take a break and continue.